Financial education is a process, and the idea of financial education is that it provides people with the skills, the knowledge, and helps them to change their behaviours perhaps, so that they become more and more financially literate. So we use these two expressions, education as the process and literacy as the outcome. And for young people, which I think is probably what we want to talk about most, financial education has been separated out so that we can talk about the content of the education, we can talk about the processes that we use, and we can talk about the context within which we might use financial education. Teachers have all kinds of wonderful ways of teaching young people to learn about everyday things, to learn about really quite abstract things. And so do parents, in fact. So I think there are lots of ways that you can play with children, that you can encourage discussion among children. One of the things to be careful is that you don't start to talk to children about their real life situation at home, because finances can be quite sensitive. So it's good to talk, to perhaps have a shop, to talk about how you would receive change, whether you calculate how much change you think you're going to get, and then check to see you've got it. You can do that with really quite young children. And as children progress through the system and through life, in fact, they'll start to come into contact with other aspects of finance. They may start to use a payment card as they get older. So then you can start to talk about more practical things. But even with quite young children, you can talk to them about wants and needs. You can talk to them about things like if they receive money, what should they do with that money? Children get given money as gifts. We've seen this from PISA, that lots of children get given money as gifts. But it's important that it seems relevant, that it's age appropriate, that it's not doing anything to upset the family balance or to negate what's happening elsewhere. And so it's important to work with stakeholders, which clearly include parents, and to find a way of talking to very young children in a way that's sensitive. Teachers benefit a lot from having a framework so that they can see a progression of what their students are expected to be able to do. We've done quite a lot of work collecting different frameworks from different countries so that schools and teachers can have a look to see what the typical content of financial education is at different ages, and how you might expect young people to go from knowing about one simple thing to several very complex ideas. So there's lots of information available. The OECD has already collected lots, and we're currently working on trying to combine that into an international framework based on the work we did for PISA, which gives us an assessment framework to measure financial literacy of older students. But for younger students, there are lots of ways in which teachers are already working with them, where they can integrate all kinds of financial education. And it's a really good idea to go through the existing teaching materials and to identify where there are aspects of finance already being discussed. And it could be anything from a study of history, which may already mention how people didn't used to use coins and why did they start to use coins. It could be a study of a particular story, and perhaps in that story a child loses something and you talk about maybe the value of that and how it might be replaced. So there are lots of ways in which you can pick up individual ideas. You could be baking in school. If you're very lucky and you still have a kitchen in your school, then you could be doing something like that. And you could talk about the process of buying the things and deciding how to choose what ingredients you put in and how much they cost and where you would go to buy them. So within lots of existing activities, even in schools, there are opportunities to talk to young people about basic money concepts. The other more complicated money concepts, talking about the use of credit and things, should be left till later. But even at a young age, there are lots of things that you can talk about. For years and years, we've recognised that one of the biggest hurdles to getting financial education in schools is that teachers are not confident to teach it. It doesn't actually mean that they're not capable of teaching it, but many of us in society, have a fear that we're not doing as well as we could when it comes to finances, that we have made mistakes in the past, that we may not fully understand what's going on in the marketplace. And that's quite reasonable, I think. So one of the most important things is to really build teachers' confidence, to give them proper training, to let them talk to people from the financial services sector, from educational training facilities, and to get them to understand that they don't necessarily need to be perfect at it themselves to be able to teach, the principles, the ideas, and that there will be a reinforcement that once they've got the principles and ideas themselves, they'll probably find that it actually helps them in their personal life. But in order to teach, you need to have a solid foundation of knowledge, and you also need to have an awareness of how it might benefit your students. So a good teacher training course would also help students to be empowered, which means that the teachers need to understand that by working with them, they will be empowering them. I think that's really important, that the teacher training shows teachers the outcomes and not just the process, and certainly not just the content. A lot of financial education, and in fact a lot of financial consumer protection as well, talks about rights and responsibilities. And we don't do anything in silo. Everything we do has an impact on our family, our loved ones, and also on our society. So I think it's important when you're teaching people about finance that you also talk to them about how that might impact on the economy, how it might impact on their personal life. And I think responsibility anyway is something that we're trying to teach and encourage among our young people. So talking about finance is one more way in which we can talk about responsibility. Even though at the end of the day you're making decisions for yourself, you're not necessarily making them only in your own best interest. You should be thinking about the impact in a wider sense. The other countries that took part in PISA are at different stages in developing financial education in schools. And a couple that really stand out are the Czech Republic and New Zealand, neither of which are geographically close, but nevertheless they're OECD countries. They do have a lot in common with Spain, and one of the things they've done is they've handed over responsibility for financial education to their ministers of education. And they've looked at ways of getting financial education into the school. And I think it's really important that you have this authority input, and by far the best is to have the Ministry of Education take responsibility for it, look at integration. I think it's a clear way forward. It's not going to be the only way forward, and it's not going to work in every country, but it's something that we're really encouraging, because financial education really has been driven from central banks, from regulators, from ministers of finance, because they've recognised the benefit to their population. And we know that education is broad, and education ministers are perhaps working with different priorities. They're being told about how it's so important to build basic maths and basic reading. But what we're saying is that financial literacy is a basic skill. And it really is an essential part of everybody's education. And it's finding a way of encouraging ministers of education to see that and to identify ways to teach it. Spain is slightly below the OECD average. In particular, it's got fewer students who scored very highly. So we look at students according to certain levels. We have 5 levels. We consider 2 to be the baseline level. And in Spain, 17% of students are below that level, and only 4% are at the very top at level 5. So Spain is a little bit below what you might like, certainly a little bit lower than the OECD average. But it actually reflects what's going on in the education system elsewhere. So it's pretty much as you would expect, given maths and reading in Spain. It's the first time that we've measured financial literacy in PISA. It was one of the drives to measure more skills-based, practical subjects. So this year there's also problem solving in PISA. It's seen as an incredibly important skill moving forward. So it was encouraged, we encouraged countries to take part. We are very grateful that Spain took part. It's a huge commitment to financial education in the future to measure the baseline, really, if you like. This is the starting point. This is the point at which we can say, okay, if we don't teach an awful lot of financial education, this is what our students can achieve. And now what you have is this incentive for teachers to say, well, I don't think that's sufficient. We don't want so many young people to be below the baseline. And so now they can move forward. And that was the real benefit of having financial literacy in PISA, and it's one of the great benefits for Spain to be able to see where they are, or to see where you are, and to move forward. Financial education is a life skill. The students in Spain need to be financially educated. They're already using bank accounts. Around about 60% of the students that took part in PISA have a bank account. They're already making electronic payments. I'm sure that many of them have mobile phones, that they're already using credit of that sort, even if it's their parents that are currently taking responsibility. Many of them will want to go into higher education, or they'll be desperately seeking a job that satisfies them, that takes them forward. All of those things are financial decisions, one way or the other. And we also know that Spain is very lucky, is that it has a very long life expectancy. But that brings with it all kinds of financial responsibilities for the long term, and the requirement that students understand that in the long term they are going to have to be responsible for themselves as adults, and that they need to start to have a vision of how they might deal with their money, manage their money, make their decisions, so that they have a cushion to protect themselves, and so that in retirement they actually have a fund to live on. Those sound like very long-term things for teachers to be thinking about, but if you don't think about those now and you only start to try and provide financial education to people in their 40s, it's going to be too late. It's going to be too late to make a difference. They're already likely to have fallen into problems. We know that there are lots of correlations between levels of financial literacy and things like over-indebtedness. So it's more likely that if your students aren't financially literate, that they'll get into problems with credit later in life. It's more likely if they aren't financially literate that the first time they lose their job, they'll find that they have no money put aside to be able to support themselves. Those are very negative outcomes that we wouldn't wish on our students, and there are ways to avoid them, and the clearest way is to work on financial education. And the benefit of doing it in school is that you're doing it before they make too many decisions and before they get into a situation where they may make too many mistakes. And I think that's really important.